The year was 2753, and humanity had finally reached the stars in a way their ancestors could only dream about. They had built cities on distant worlds. They had turned dead planets into living gardens. They had spread across 3 solar systems and called them home. For the first time in their long history, the people of Earth felt like they truly belonged in the universe. When the message arrived from the Galactic Council, the entire human race celebrated. The Council was the ruling body of all civilized species in the galaxy. They controlled over 4,000 different races. They had existed for more than 1,000,000 years, and now they were inviting humanity to join them as members. Admiral Daniel Carter was chosen to lead the delegation. He was a tall man with gray hair and steady eyes. He had served in the space fleet for over 40 years. He had fought pirates and explored unknown regions, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. He stood on the bridge of the diplomatic vessel Resolute Dawn and watched the stars pass by. Beside him stood Ambassador Catherine Price. She was a woman of 60 years with sharp features and a sharper mind. She had spent her entire life studying alien cultures. She had learned 17 different languages. She believed that this day would mark the beginning of a new era for humanity. The journey to Council Station took 3 weeks. When they arrived, both Daniel and Catherine stood in silence. The station was enormous beyond belief. It orbited a neutron star, using the powerful gravity to hold its massive structure in place. Millions of beings lived and worked there. Ships from every corner of the galaxy came and went like tiny insects around a great hive. The Resolute Dawn docked at a port reserved for new species. A group of alien guards escorted the human delegation through corridors that seemed to stretch forever. The walls were made of materials that Daniel did not recognize. The air smelled strange, filled with scents from 1,000 different worlds. Finally, they reached the council chamber. Daniel had seen pictures of it in the files they had received. But the pictures did not capture the true scale of the place. The chamber was circular and stretched upward for what seemed like miles. Thousands of platforms floated in the air, each one holding representatives from different species. Some were small creatures covered in fur. Others were tall beings made of crystal. Some had no solid form at all, existing only as clouds of colored light. At the center of the chamber sat the High Tribunal. These were the 5 most ancient species in the galaxy. They had ruled the Council since its creation. Their word was law. Their judgment was final. High Arbiter Velthos spoke first. He was a being of pure silver light, towering over 20 feet tall. His voice echoed through the chamber like thunder. He welcomed the human delegation and announced that the Council had reviewed their application for membership. Daniel felt his heart beating faster. Catherine stood perfectly still beside him. Around them, thousands of alien eyes watched and waited. Velthos continued speaking. He said that after careful consideration, the Council had reached a unanimous decision. The application from the species known as humans was rejected. A murmur spread through the chamber. Daniel felt as if someone had struck him in the chest. Catherine's face went pale. But they remained standing, waiting to hear the reasons. Velthos was happy to provide them. He said that humanity was too young. They had only been traveling among the stars for a few thousand years. Most Council species had been doing so for millions. He said that humanity was too aggressive. Their history was filled with wars, violence, and destruction. He said that humanity was too primitive. Their technology, while impressive for such a young race, was far below Council standards. The chamber filled with sounds that Daniel realized were laughter. Thousands of species were laughing at them. Laughing at humanity, laughing at everything they had achieved. But the humiliation was not over. Velthos raised one hand made of silver light and demanded silence. He announced that the Council had decided to take additional measures. The 3 colony worlds that humanity had settled outside their original solar system would be seized. These worlds would be given to species that deserved them. Human settlers would be removed and relocated. Catherine stepped forward. Her voice was strong despite the shock she felt. She demanded to know where her people would go. She demanded to know what right the council had to take what humanity had built. Veltos answered coldly. He said that humanity would be given a single moon on the edge of known space. It was a frozen rock with no atmosphere and no resources. It was called Designation 7749. The humans could live there, away from civilized society, where they could no longer be a threat to anyone. Catherine opened her mouth to protest further. Before she could speak, one of the council guards struck her across the face. She fell backward, and Daniel caught her in his arms. Blood ran from a cut on her cheek. The chamber erupted in laughter once more. Species that had never met humans before pointed and mocked. They called out insults in languages that the translation devices struggled to process. They treated the human delegation like animals in a zoo. Daniel helped Catherine to her feet. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from rage. He wanted to fight. He wanted to strike back at every creature in that chamber. But he knew that doing so would mean death for his entire species. The guards escorted them out of the chamber. The laughter followed them all the way back to their ship. When the Resolute Dawn returned to Earth, the news spread across every human world. People watched the recordings from the council chamber in horror and disbelief. They saw Catherine Price struck down. They heard the laughter of 4,000 species. On the colony worlds, families received evacuation notices. They were given 30 days to leave their homes, 30 days to abandon the cities they had built, the farms they had cultivated, the graves of their loved ones. Ships arrived to transport them to Earth or to the frozen moon that would be their new prison. 3 billion humans were forced to leave everything behind. They carried only what they could fit in their hands. They watched through the windows of transport ships as their worlds grew smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely. The galaxy celebrated the Council's decision. They called it wise and necessary. They said that humanity had been put in its proper place. They believed that the young species would fade away on their frozen moon, forgotten by history. But they did not understand humans. In the darkness of their grief, in the ashes of their pride, something new was being born. It was a fire that would not die. It was a promise that would not be broken. Humanity would remember this day, and one day they would make the galaxy remember it too. On the frozen surface of Designation 7749, Daniel Carter stood beside Catherine Price. They looked up at the stars that had rejected them. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. But in their eyes, there was something that the Galactic Council had failed to notice. It was the beginning of revenge. 10 years passed in silence. The galaxy forgot about humans. They became a joke, a warning story told to young species about what happens when you reach too high too fast. The council members returned to their ancient routines. They traded with each other. They fought small wars over territory. They lived as they had lived for millions of years, never changing, never growing. They had no idea what was happening on that frozen moon. Designation 7749 was exactly as the council had described. It was a dead world covered in ice and rock. There was no air to breathe. There was no water to drink. There was nothing but endless cold and darkness. The council had expected humanity to slowly die there, too busy surviving to cause any trouble. They had made a terrible mistake. Commander Nathan Brooks walked through the underground tunnels that now stretched for hundreds of miles beneath the frozen surface. He was a young man with dark skin and determined eyes. He had been only 20 years old when the humiliation happened. He had watched the recordings of Catherine Price being struck down. He had sworn on that day that he would dedicate his life to making things right. Around him, thousands of workers moved with quiet purpose. They were building things, weapons, ships, machines that the galaxy had never seen before. In the years since their exile, humanity had changed. The grief and anger had transformed into something powerful. Every human worked together with a single goal. They would become strong. They would become so strong that no one would ever hurt them again. The scientists studied every piece of alien technology they had encountered during their brief contact with galactic civilization. They took apart communication devices, medical tools, and engine components. They learned how each one worked. Then they made them better. The galaxy had grown lazy over millions of years. The ancient species believed they had discovered everything worth discovering. They used the same technology their ancestors had created long ago. They never asked if there might be a better way. Humans always asked that question. Admiral Daniel Carter, now 73 years old, stood in the command center of the underground facility. His hair had turned completely white. His face was lined with age, but his eyes were still sharp, still burning with the same fire that had been lit on the day of their humiliation. He looked at the display screens that covered the walls. Each screen showed a different part of their operation. Hidden shipyards carved into asteroids, factory complexes buried beneath moons, training facilities where millions of soldiers prepared for the day they would fight back. Nathan Brooks entered the command center and saluted. He reported that all fleets were ready. Operation Silent Thunder could begin at any time. Daniel nodded slowly. He had waited 10 years for this moment. He had watched Catherine Price work tirelessly as she rose from ambassador to president of the United Human Territories. He had seen children grow into soldiers. He had attended funerals for those who did not live long enough to see this day. Now it was time. Catherine Price appeared on the main screen. She was broadcasting from a secure location on Earth. Her face still bore a small scar from where the council guard had struck her. She had refused to have it removed. She wanted to remember. She addressed all of humanity first. She told them that the waiting was over. She told them that the galaxy would learn what it meant to humiliate the human race. Then she switched to a universal broadcast that would reach every corner of known space. Her message was simple. She reminded the galaxy of what they had done 10 years ago. She reminded them of the laughter, the cruelty, the injustice. She told them that humanity had not forgotten, and now humanity had come to collect what was owed. The fleet emerged from hiding places scattered across the outer regions of space. Over 10,000 warships appeared where moments before there had been nothing. Each ship was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Their engines used quantum singularities, tiny black holes that provided unlimited power. Their shields were made of folded space itself, able to withstand the heat of a star. Their weapons could tear holes in reality, sending enemy vessels into the void between dimensions. The Council had ancient technology that had not changed in ages. Humanity had spent 10 years building the future. The first target was the Velthosian homeworld. High Arbiter Velthos had led the mockery of humanity. His species had laughed the loudest. They would be the first to understand their mistake. Nathan Brooks commanded the assault fleet. His flagship, the Eternal Vigilance, dropped out of faster-than-light travel directly above the Velthosian capital city. Orbital defense platforms immediately opened fire. Their weapons were powerful enough to destroy most ships in the galaxy. The Eternal Vigilance did not even raise its shields. The enemy fire struck the ship and did nothing. The beams of energy simply vanished when they touched the hull. The missiles detonated harmlessly against invisible barriers. Inside the command center, Nathan watched the display screens with cold satisfaction. He gave the order to respond. The human weapons fired once, a single pulse of energy that seemed to fold space around itself. When it struck the orbital defense platforms, they simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed, not damaged. Gone. erased from reality as if they had never been built. The Velthosian military tried to scramble their fleet. Before the first ship could launch, Nathan had already destroyed their shipyards. The entire battle, if it could be called a battle, lasted less than 3 minutes. Human Marines landed on the surface. They marched through the silver streets of the Velthosian capital while the native population watched in terror. But the humans did not come to kill. They did not come to conquer. They came to deliver a message. The Marines found the Monument of Judgment, a massive structure built to commemorate the day humanity was rejected from the Council. Every year, the Velthosians gathered there to celebrate their victory over the primitive humans. The Marines placed charges around the base of the monument. With a single explosion, it crumbled to dust. In its place, they planted a flag bearing the symbol of the United Human Territories. Then they left. Throughout the galaxy, species that had laughed at humanity now watched the news feeds in horror. The Velthosians, one of the 5 ruling species of the Council, had been humiliated in their own home. Their defenses had proven useless. Their military had been swept aside like dust in the wind. And the humans had done it with just 1 fleet. High Arbiter Velthos received the news while sitting in his chamber on Council Station. For the first time in his long life, he felt something he had never experienced before: fear. He called an emergency meeting of the High Tribunal. They needed to respond. They needed to crush this rebellion before it spread. They had 4,000 species under their command. They had millions of warships. Surely they could defeat one young race. But deep in his heart, Velthos was no longer certain of anything. The humans had struck back, and this was only the beginning. The Galactic Council called an emergency session for the first time in 300,000 years. The great chamber that had once echoed with laughter now filled with frightened whispers. Representatives from thousands of species gathered on their floating platforms, but the mood was nothing like it had been 10 years ago. There were no jokes about primitive humans. There were no celebrations of council wisdom. There was only fear. High Arbiter Velthos stood at the center of the chamber, his silver form glowing brighter than usual. He demanded order. He commanded the assembled species to remember their strength. They had ruled the galaxy for over 1,000,000 years. They would not be threatened by one young race that had gotten lucky in a single battle. He called for all member species to contribute their military forces to a combined fleet. Together, they would crush the human rebellion. Together, they would restore order to the galaxy. Together, they would remind these primitives of their proper place. The chamber fell silent. Velthos waited for the pledges of support to come flooding in. Instead, a single figure walked through the main entrance. Ambassador Melissa Grant was 35 years old. She had grown up on one of the colony worlds that the Council had seized. She remembered being forced onto a transport ship as a child. She remembered watching her home disappear through the window. She had studied diplomacy not because she loved peace, but because she understood that words could be weapons too. She walked alone into the chamber of 4,000 species. She carried no weapons. She wore no armor. She showed no fear. The council guards moved to stop her, but Velthos raised a hand. He wanted to hear what this human had to say. Perhaps she had come to surrender. Perhaps she had come to beg for mercy. Melissa stood in the center of the chamber and looked up at the assembled representatives. Her voice was calm and clear as she began to speak. She did not come to threaten, she told them. She did not come to make demands. She came to offer a choice. Humanity had no desire to rule the galaxy, she explained. They had seen what happened when one species held power over all others. They had experienced the cruelty and injustice of such a system. They would not become the very thing they had fought against, but they would also not accept a galaxy where the strong could abuse the weak without consequence. They would not stand by while ancient powers crushed young species simply for being different. She offered an alternative. Any species that wished to stand with humanity would be welcomed as allies. They would be protected. They would be treated as equals. They would help build a new kind of civilization, one based on respect and cooperation instead of fear and domination. The chamber erupted in angry shouts. Velthos demanded that the guards remove this insolent creature. He called her offer an insult to everything the council represented. But before the guards could move, something unexpected happened. A small figure rose from one of the lower platforms. It was a Morvathi, a member of a species known for their peaceful nature and their skill in trade. The Morvathi had been part of the council for 500,000 years. They had never caused trouble. They had never complained. They had simply accepted their place in the system. The Morvathi ambassador spoke in a quiet voice that somehow filled the entire chamber. He said that his people had suffered under council rule for longer than most species had existed. They had been exploited, taxed, and treated as servants. They had watched other peaceful races be destroyed for minor offenses. They had lived in fear for generations. Today, he announced, the fear ended. The Morvathi would not fight against humanity. They would stand with them. The chamber fell into shocked silence. Then another voice spoke up. It was the representative of the Krellian collective, a species of hive-minded insects that had been relegated to the lowest levels of council society. They too would stand with humanity. One by one, other species began to rise. The Vorthani, a race of gentle giants who had been forced to work in mines for millennia. The Solari, beautiful beings of living crystal who had been treated as decorations rather than people. The Northak, fierce warriors who had been conquered and humiliated centuries ago. Within an hour, over 800 species had pledged their support to humanity. Melissa Grant watched as nearly a quarter of the council abandoned their seats and gathered around her. She had hoped that some would join them. She had never imagined it would be this many. She looked up at High Arbiter Velthos. The silver being was trembling with rage. His light flickered and pulsed as he struggled to contain his fury. The new alliance needed a name. The representatives debated for only a few moments before agreeing. They would call themselves the Free Worlds Alliance, and they elected Melissa Grant as their first speaker. Velthos finally found his voice. He declared that all species who stood with humanity were traitors. He ordered the remaining loyal members to attack the defectors. He promised that every world belonging to these rebels would be burned to ash. The first shots of the Galactic Civil War were fired 3 days later. A council fleet of 1,500 ships entered the Morvathi home system. They had orders to make an example of the first species to betray the council. They intended to destroy the Morvathi completely, to show the galaxy what happened to traitors. Commander Nathan Brooks received the distress call on the bridge of the Eternal Vigilance. He did not hesitate. He gathered a battle group of 200 ships and jumped to the Morvathi system immediately. The council commanders laughed when they saw how badly they outnumbered the human fleet. Their confidence lasted until the first exchange of fire. Human weapons tore through council ships like they were made of paper. Shields that had protected vessels for thousands of years offered no resistance. Engines that had carried fleets across the galaxy exploded in brilliant flashes of light. The battle lasted less than an hour. When it was over, more than 1,000 council ships had been destroyed. The human fleet had lost only 3 vessels. Nathan Brooks broadcast a message to the surviving council ships. He told them to return to their masters and deliver a warning. Any attack on a member of the Free Worlds Alliance would be met with overwhelming force. Humanity protected its friends. The survivors fled. On the Morvathi homeworld, millions of beings watched the human ships take up protective positions in orbit. They had lived in fear of the Council for 500,000 years. They had accepted abuse and exploitation as the natural order of things. Now they were free. The Morvathi ambassador contacted Melissa Grant to express his gratitude. He asked how they could ever repay what humanity had done for them. Melissa smiled. She told him there was no debt to repay. That was the whole point. In the Free Worlds Alliance, species helped each other not because they expected something in return, but because it was the right thing to do. The war had begun. The galaxy would never be the same again. The war burned across the galaxy for 3 long years. The Galactic Council controlled thousands of species and millions of warships. They had ruled the stars since before most civilizations had learned to use fire. They commanded resources that could crush entire sectors of space. They believed that their victory was inevitable. They were wrong. The Free Worlds Alliance grew stronger with each passing month. More species joined the rebellion. Some came because they hated the Council. Some came because they believed in what humanity represented. Some came simply because they wanted to be on the winning side. Whatever their reasons, they all contributed to the war effort. Human technology spread through the Alliance. The Morvathi learned to build quantum shields. The Krellian collective mastered the art of space-folding weapons. The Vorthani contributed their knowledge of heavy manufacturing. What had begun as a human rebellion became a true alliance of equals, each species sharing their strengths. The Council fought back with desperate fury. They burned entire worlds that refused to submit. They executed prisoners without mercy. They used weapons that had been banned for millions of years. But nothing they did could stop the tide. Captain Gregory Palmer stood on the bridge of his carrier, the Dawn of Liberty. He was 40 years old, with a shaved head and a face marked by scars from a dozen battles. He had started the war as a lieutenant commanding a small patrol ship. 3 years of constant fighting had promoted him faster than peacetime service ever could. Now he commanded the assault fleet tasked with the most important mission of the war. They were going to capture Council Station itself. The station orbited the neutron star at the heart of Council territory. It was the symbol of their power, the place where humanity had been humiliated 23 years ago. Capturing it would not end the war, but it would show the galaxy that the Council was no longer invincible. The battle group consisted of 300 human vessels and 700 allied ships. They jumped into the system expecting fierce resistance. They found it. The Council had gathered over 3,000 warships to defend the station. They had brought their most advanced weapons, their most experienced commanders, their most loyal soldiers. They would not surrender this place without a fight. Gregory Palmer studied the tactical display. The enemy outnumbered them significantly. A direct assault would result in massive casualties on both sides. He smiled. Humans had never been afraid of fighting against the odds. The Dawn of Liberty led the charge. Human carriers launched thousands of fighters that swarmed through the enemy formation. Alliance cruisers engaged the Council battle lines while human destroyers targeted the station's defense platforms. The fighting was brutal. Ships exploded in blinding flashes of light. Debris fields spread across millions of miles. Thousands of beings died in the vacuum of space. But slowly, steadily, the Alliance pushed forward. Gregory Palmer ordered the final assault. The Dawn of Liberty accelerated toward the station, firing every weapon it had. Enemy fire struck the ship again and again. Sections of the hull were torn away. Fires broke out on multiple decks, but the ship kept moving. They reached the station just as the last Council defenders fell. Human Marines stormed through the docking bays and into the corridors where the High Tribunal had ruled for over 1,000,000 years. When the smoke cleared, the human flag flew over Council Station. The symbol of everything that had oppressed and humiliated them was now in their hands. But the war was not over. High Arbiter Velthos had fled before the station fell. He rallied the remaining loyal species for a final stand at a place called the Throne of Ages. The throne was an artificial world, built by the first Council races in the early days of their civilization. It served as the spiritual heart of their authority. Ancient artifacts and sacred relics were stored there. To the Council loyalists, it represented everything they were fighting for. Admiral Daniel Carter insisted on leading the final assault himself. He was 93 years old now. His body was failing. His doctors warned him that the stress of battle could kill him. He did not care. He had waited too long for this moment. He had carried the memory of humanity's humiliation for too many years. He would see this through to the end, even if it cost him his life. Catherine Price, now 91 years old, joined him aboard the flagship. She too had waited for this day. She still bore the scar from where the council guard had struck her all those years ago. Together they would finish what had begun in that chamber of mockery. The Battle of the Throne of Ages was the largest military engagement in the history of the galaxy. Over 1 million ships gathered in the space around the artificial world. The Council had called in every last reserve. The Alliance had brought every vessel they could spare. The fate of the galaxy would be decided in this one place. The fighting lasted for 7 days. Entire fleets were destroyed in hours. Planets in nearby systems were struck by stray fire. The energy released was so enormous that it could be detected on the other side of the galaxy. On the 8th day, the Alliance broke through the final defensive line. Human Marines landed on the surface of the Throne of Ages. They fought through ancient halls filled with treasures from 1 million years of history. They pushed past the last desperate defenders until they reached the inner sanctum. Daniel Carter walked into the throne room with Catherine Price at his side. They were both old and tired. They had given their lives to this cause. Now they would see it completed. High Arbiter Velthos waited for them. He stood before the ancient thrones where the High Tribunal had sat since the beginning of the Council. His silver form flickered weakly, drained by the stress of the battle. He asked what the humans wanted. Did they intend to execute him? Did they plan to take his place as tyrants? Catherine Price answered him. She said that humanity wanted only one thing. They wanted him to watch as everything he had built was torn down. They wanted him to see the birth of a new galaxy, one where no species would ever again be humiliated for being young or different. The High Tribunal was dissolved. The ancient thrones were removed and placed in a museum. The Throne of Ages was transformed into a memorial for all the species that had suffered under Council rule. Velthos and his followers were exiled to a distant corner of the galaxy. They were stripped of their technology and their power. They would survive by their own merits, just as they had once forced humanity to do. Daniel Carter stood in the empty throne room after the ceremony was complete. He looked around at the place that had represented power for over 1 million years. Now it was just a room. The war was over. The tyrants had fallen. Humanity had won. 20 years had passed since the war ended. The galaxy had transformed in ways that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. The old order was gone, swept away like dust in a cosmic wind. In its place, something new had grown. Something better. The Free Worlds Alliance now included over 3,000 species. They came from every corner of known space. Some were ancient races that had existed for millions of years. Some were young civilizations that had only recently discovered faster than light travel. All of them were welcome. All of them were equal. The capital of the Alliance was a world called New Unity. It had been built from nothing by humans and their allies working side by side. Every species had contributed something to its creation. The Morvathi had designed the transportation systems. The Krellian Collective had grown the living buildings. The Vorthani had carved the great monuments. The humans had coordinated everything, bringing together thousands of different ideas into one beautiful whole. At the center of New Unity stood the Hall of Voices. This was where the Alliance government met, where decisions were made that affected trillions of beings across thousands of worlds. Unlike the old council chamber, there were no floating platforms arranged by power or importance. Every representative sat at the same level. Every voice carried the same weight. Speaker Melissa Grant had served for 15 years. She had guided the Alliance through its difficult early days when old hatreds and new fears threatened to tear them apart. She had built bridges between species that had been enemies for millennia. She had shown the galaxy that different did not have to mean divided. Now she was ready to step down. Her successor was chosen not from humanity, but from the Morvathi. Ambassador Kellis Rin had been the first to stand with humans during the emergency council session all those years ago. His species had suffered more than most under the old regime. Now he would help lead the new one. The gesture was deliberate. Humanity had never sought to rule the galaxy. They had fought to free it, not to own it. By choosing a Morvathi as the new speaker, they proved that their words had been true all along. On Earth, in a small cemetery overlooking the Pacific Ocean, a funeral was taking place. Admiral Daniel Carter had passed away peacefully at the age of 113. He had lived long enough to see everything he had fought for come true. He had witnessed the fall of the old council. He had watched the rise of the Free Worlds Alliance. He had seen species that once mocked humanity now call them friends and allies. His funeral was attended by representatives from every corner of the galaxy. Beings of light and shadow, of crystal and flesh, of energy and matter, all gathered to honor the man who had led humanity through its darkest hour. Former enemies wept alongside old friends. The divisions of the past meant nothing on this day. Catherine Price stood before the gathered mourners. She was 91 years old, white-haired and frail, but her eyes still held the same sharp intelligence they always had. She had been beside Daniel at the beginning. She would speak for him at the end. She told them about the day they had been humiliated before the old council. She described the laughter, the cruelty, the overwhelming sense of injustice. She remembered how Daniel had caught her when she fell, how his hands had been shaking with rage. She remembered the look in his eyes as they were escorted out of that chamber like criminals. But she also remembered what came after. The determination that had filled every human heart. The unity that had brought them together as never before. The refusal to accept defeat, no matter how impossible victory seemed. She said that Daniel Carter had embodied everything that made humanity special, not their technology, which could be copied, not their weapons, which could be matched, but their spirit, which could never be broken. Humanity had proven something during their years of exile and war, she continued. They had proven that no species, no matter how powerful, could crush those who refused to surrender. They had proven that the young could teach the old, that the new could surpass the ancient, that the dismissed could become the deliverers, and most importantly, they had proven that strength meant nothing without wisdom, and wisdom meant nothing without kindness. Commander Nathan Brooks stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the ceremony with tears in his eyes. He was an old man now, his hair gray and his face lined with age. He had fought in every major battle of the war. He had lost friends beyond counting. He had seen things that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But he had also seen the impossible become possible. He had watched a young species rise from humiliation to become the heart of a new galactic order. He had helped build something that would last for generations. His granddaughter stood beside him. She was 12 years old with curious eyes and an endless supply of questions. She had grown up in a galaxy at peace, surrounded by alien friends. The war was history to her, something she learned about in school. She asked him what would happen next. Would there be more wars? More enemies? Nathan looked up at the stars. He told her that there would always be challenges. There would always be those who sought power over others. The universe was vast and full of unknowns. Dangers that they could not imagine waited in the darkness between galaxies. But humanity had learned something precious during their years of exile, he said. They had learned that their greatest strength was not their ships or their weapons. It was their ability to find friends, to build alliances, to inspire others to believe in something better. They had started alone, with nothing but a frozen moon and a burning desire for justice. Now they stood at the heart of an alliance that spanned the galaxy. They had not conquered, they had united. The funeral ended as the sun set over the ocean. The mourners departed, carrying memories of a man who had changed history. Daniel Carter was laid to rest in the soil of the world his ancestors had called home for millions of years. On New Unity, a new generation of humans and aliens worked side by side. They built ships that would explore the unknown reaches of the cosmos. They developed technologies that would improve the lives of trillions. They created art and music and literature that blended the cultures of thousands of worlds. The Galactic Council had once laughed at humanity. They had called them primitive, aggressive, unworthy. They had tried to crush them, to confine them, to erase them from history. They had failed. Humanity had struck back, but more importantly, they had helped the galaxy move forward. The old ways of fear and domination were gone. In their place stood cooperation, respect, and hope. Far beyond the borders of known space, in the exile where the old council leaders had been sent, High Arbiter Veltos looked up at the stars. He was old now, his silver light dimmed by time and defeat. He remembered the day he had humiliated those primitive humans in his chamber. He remembered the laughter that had filled the hall. He did not laugh anymore. The galaxy had changed, and it would never change back. This was humanity's legacy. This was their gift to the universe. A new dawn had begun.